We will be starting promptly in 4 minutes. So again, please make sure that you are in your seats. We still have some people shuffling in. Make sure you're scooped together. Obviously, a lot of people are excited to see Mr. Ben Shapiro. We'll be starting in 4 minutes. We are really excited. Thank you all for coming.
Good evening, and thank you, everyone. My name is Connor Brinton, and I'm the founder and chairman of Grand Canyon University's Young Americans for Freedom Chapter. On behalf of the Young Americans Foundation at GCU, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you and the thousands joining us online to to Why We Need Both Faith and Reason, presented by Ben Shapiro. But first, let me give you some background. YAF was founded in 1962 for the purpose of increasing the number of young Americans who are exposed to conservative ideas. Then, in 1998, YAF saved the Reagan Ranch, and they now use it to pass on conservative ideals that Ronald Reagan so strongly believed in. It was after I was able to visit the Reagan Ranch that I was motivated to found a Young Americans for Freedom chapter. There were only 3 of us at our first meeting. We started advertising our club using posters like this that said #BringBen. From the beginning, our goal was to bring conservative thought to campus. And we've been honored to host several national speakers, including Andrew Clavin, Michael Knowles, and Allie Stuckey. But the question I always got asked was, when are you guys going to bring Ben Shapiro? Well, GCUF, we did it. We brought Ben. Promises made, promises kept, am I right? As I look out over the 1,800 attending tonight, and think about the thousands more joining us online, I can't help but be filled with gratitude. I want to thank our many GCUF members for all their hard work in representing our club and hosting this event. You guys seriously are great, so thank you. I also want to thank the National YAF leadership for their support along the way. Their assistance in overcoming opposition was instrumental in making tonight happen. I'd also like to thank Fred Allen for sponsoring this lecture series and for our local donors for their support. Without you guys, we couldn't do any of this. Thanks to all the GCU staff, especially the event services and public safety teams who have helped us put on this event. And I'd like to include Phoenix Police Department for helping out. That was really great. In addition, I'd like to thank those of you in the community who have helped us defend free speech on our campus. Thanks to all of you, opponents of free speech will think twice about silencing conservative points of view. I personally want to thank Ben Shapiro for choosing to come to Grand Canyon University. Out of the thousands of schools who applied to hear him speak, we are thankful to have you in Low Country tonight, Ben. And finally, I want to thank God, for without Him, nothing is possible, but through Him, we can hope to achieve the seemingly impossible. Tonight's presentation, we ask everyone to be respectful. If you attempt to disrupt the lecture and the Q&A, you will be removed immediately from the venue. Please, for the Q&A, form a line that will be right over here. Keep your questions brief so we can hear from as many students as possible. Also, if you're interested in getting involved with GCUF, or you just want some premium content in your feed, feel free to follow us at GCUF 1776. And with that, Ben Shapiro is editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire and host of the Ben Shapiro Show, the largest conservative podcast and radio show in the nation. Mr. Shapiro is a leading conservative speaker on college campuses, consistently defending free speech and open debate. Shapiro is the author of 8 books, including the #1 bestseller, the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. Shapiro has also been a nationally syndicated columnist since the age of 17 and is a graduate from UCLA and Harvard Law. The Washington Post calls him a foe of extraordinary polemical agility, and the New York Times calls him the cool kid's philosopher. Right, yeah. Something we can actually do with the New York Times on. Rush Limbaugh says Shapiro isn't just content to have people be dazzled by his brilliance. He actually goes out, confronts, and tries to persuade, mobilize, and motivate people. Glenn Beck calls Shapiro a warrior for conservatism against those who use fear and intimidation to stifle honest debate. I've never known him to back down from a fight. Everyone, please help me in giving a warm welcome to Ben Shapiro.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. No. Okay. First of all, let me start by saying thank you to everyone for coming out tonight and wasting your weeknight with me. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Fred Allen and Young America's Foundation. Thanks to GCU, YAF, for doing everything they've done to make sure that this could happen. Thank you to security for ensuring that we can have a great event tonight. And thanks to Grand Canyon University's administration for hosting me, eventually. So I'm not going to make a big deal out of this. I do have a couple of things to say on it. For people who are watching online and missed the hubbub, GCU was slated to host me a little bit earlier this year. At the beginning of February, the administration suddenly decided that they were not going to do so, and then they issued a statement claiming that while they believe, quote, in many of the things that Ben Shapiro speaks about and stands for, including his support for ideals that grow out of traditional Judeo-Christian values and his belief in a free market economy, they wanted to, quote, focus on opportunities that bring people together. As we can see tonight, those values and the core value of free speech and open discussion and debate bring a hell of a lot of people together in massive numbers. I got legitimately hundreds of emails from people who are upset about GCU's decision, so thank you to all of those who made their voices heard to the administration here. Thank you to the administration for finally relenting. It was the right thing to do. And one final note on this subject before I actually move to the substance of the speech, with which I think the administration will generally agree. That is, that the original GCU administrative note stated they wanted to stop me from speaking in order to find a path toward unity. The administration said in their note that in banning me, they were attempting to, and I want to quote this, make peace in a way that honors Christ. The only path toward unity, as both the Old and, even in my passing familiarity with the New Testament, teaches, the only path toward unity is the path of truth. And that path can only be discovered by recognizing the inherent value in respectful, dignified examination of crucial issues. The only peace worth having is based on shared values that undergird our civilization, values worth defending. King David says in Psalm 34, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. God says in Deuteronomy, tzedek tzedek tirdoth, the Hebrew, righteousness, righteousness shall we pursue. There can be no peace without righteousness. And so we pursue righteousness because we love peace. We stand for values because we love peace. We seek unity in righteousness, not in platitudes, not in glossing over differences. As Psalm 85 says, I will listen to what God the Lord says. He promises peace to his people, his faithful servants, but let them not turn to folly. All right. Now to the actual substance of the speech. So, right now, I think in Western civilization, we're having a crisis of meaning. That's pretty obvious from a couple of simple facts. We're the most prosperous free society in the history of humanity. If you could pick any time to be born, you would pick right now, right here. There's no other time to pick. A baby born today can expect to live in excess of 80 years in incredible material prosperity that the richest people living in 1900 could never have considered. The average person in 1850s Europe died before the age of 40. In 1900, 1 in 10 children in the United States died before their first birthday. We now live in a country where infant mortality is unbelievably low, in a civilization where if you have a baby and the baby is born even remotely healthy, that baby will live for another 8 decades in health and prosperity. We live in a society where we have tremendous freedom to basically do what we want. A society where we get to choose how we live our lives. We get to bear the consequences of those choices. And in many cases, we don't even bear the consequences of those choices because the government is there to provide a social safety net. And yet, we seem unhappier than ever in many ways. The opioid epidemic is taking an increasing number of lives. Actual life expectancy in the United States has declined for the last couple of years, which is unheard of in a civilized society. It's been rising consistently year on year for decades. You can look at the rates of unhappiness in society. You can look at the rates of depression. You can look at drug use. You can look at the fact that, according to polls, our trust in key institutions has dramatically decreased. You can look at the fact that fewer and fewer of us trust our neighbors or even know our neighbors. It's not just economic divide. This is not a question of rich versus poor, because a lot of these problems seem to span economics. There are a lot of very unhappy rich people, a lot of very angry rich people, and you can feel it in the 2016 election particularly. This is when I started to feel it. It felt like there was something different happening. People were truly enraged at one another. You're really enraged, looking at each other and saying, I can't be friends with you because we differ on policy. We see it in the preparation for the 2020 race, where the easiest way to run in 2020 is by castigating the motives of your opponent as somehow inferior or terrible. To take a quick example, when Mayor Pete Buttigieg over in South Bend, Indiana, declared, I have to say that I was kind of attracted to his candidacy because he was the only person running who didn't seem like a crazy person. Right? Pete Buttigieg said, I disagree with the founders of Chick-fil-A on their politics, but they make a pretty good chicken sandwich. And that sounded pretty good to me. And then in the last couple of weeks, we have seen Mayor Buttigieg, who has never been mistreated by Vice President Mike Pence, not once in his life, talk about Mike Pence as though Mike Pence is out to get him. Suggest that Mike Pence is filled with animus and rage and anger, and that Mike Pence is trying to victimize him. There's no evidence of any of these things. In 2014, when Buttigieg, a member of the National Guard, was called into service, Mike Pence personally called him to thank him. In 2015, when Buttigieg came out of the closet, Mike Pence was asked about it. He said, I think Buttigieg is a good man. And now Buttigieg is going around bad-mouthing Pence, suggesting that he's a fanatic straight out of The Handmaid's Tale, and imputing to him an animus that Pence has never exhibited, suggesting that Pence is motivated by this evil hatred for gay people that Pence obviously does not have in his life. And it's easy to do that. We're doing this on all sides of the aisle, suggesting that people we disagree with simply on politics, that this is really about their underlying motives. They are bad people, and thus it's okay for us to be mean to them and be terrible to them. So what exactly has happened? I think what has happened is that there is a God-shaped hole in the American heart, and we are filling it with tribalism, and we are filling it with partisanship, and we are filling it with rage. And this is coming from somebody who spends his entire life in politics. And I'm not innocent in this, because anyone in politics is not. I've tried to do my best. I've tried to repent when I've done wrong. But I think that if you engage in the political sphere, it's hard not to get sucked into it. But the question is, do you try to do better? No, I do try to do better, I hope. But the bottom line is that it is easier to do better when you feel that there is a deeper thing that unites us as Americans and unites us as a civilization. And that unity feels like it's falling apart. It's why you hear increased talk of separation, like legitimately, people talking about the possibility of a separation between the states. Okay, this is now being discussed more commonly. The possibility of government completely falling apart. Why? Well, because our civilization has lost what it means to be happy. So we've substituted the idea of hedonism or temporary joy for happiness. So Western civilization was built on a certain perception of what happiness was, what made human beings happy, and what made a civilization happy. And it was built on two separate definitions that in the end are basically the same definition. One is the biblical definition of happiness. So in the Bible, it talks about simcha. And the Hebrew word simcha does not mean you like to go golfing sometimes. It means that it does not mean that you look at pornography and this gives you a temporary feeling of joy. Instead, what simcha was right action in accordance with God's will. Religion believes that if you are acting in accordance with God's will, this is what brings you happiness because this is what you were put on earth to do. It's a purpose-centered life, obviously. And if you look at Aristotelian thought, Greek thought, it was also driven by effectively the same argument, that true happiness, eudaimonia in Aristotle's phraseology, was a matter of being active in accord with complete virtue. And complete virtue was you using your reason to discover what your purpose was and then acting in accordance with that purpose. Use your use of reason to dominate your nature, to curb your nature and channel your nature towards something higher. We've forgotten about all of that, because we've decided that other things were more important, and also because we've done away with the two poles of our civilization, Jerusalem and Athens. We've done away with Judeo-Christian values and Greek reason. Those were the forces, as I'll explain in a second, that undergirded the four elements that are necessary to making a civilization happy, to building a civilization capable of both simcha and eudaimonia. So what do we need to achieve happiness? We need four things. Pretty basic things. One, individual moral purpose. We each have to get up in the morning and feel like we have something to do. People who feel useless are depressed. People who feel like they don't have connections with others. People who feel like they don't have a mission in the world. These are people who lose meaning and they get depressed and they act out against others. You have to feel like you have a reason for being. You also have to feel like you have a capacity to act out to make that purpose happen. Like you are a powerful thing. You are not just a cork being bobbed about on the eddies of the world. Instead, you are a powerful individual with creative and reasoned capacity. You can make decisions, and those decisions have practical effects, practical ramifications, and good ramifications. And so you have to have individual moral purpose and individual capacity. You have to feel like you can do something. Free will. You're responsible for your actions. You also have to have communal moral purpose. You have to feel like you and your neighbors together have something in common. And that communal moral purpose is building a better community for yourselves. Not through the mechanism of government, but because we love each other as brothers and sisters. Communal moral purpose was the idea of the social fabric. There's a social scientist named Robert Putnam, who works over at Harvard University, wrote a very good book called Building Alone, in which he coined the term social capital. And what he talks about in the book is he says that he used to be a big believer in the nostrum that is very often stated in politics, that diversity is our strength. He said, yeah, I really believe diversity is our strength. Then he did the research, and what he found is that ethnic diversity in a community predicted only two things. One, increased protest marches. Two, increased television watching. But that is not an argument against diversity itself. It's an argument against communities that don't have roots, because what he found is that diversity was indeed strength in places like churches. If you go to a church where everybody is worshiping in the same direction, where everybody has the same moral values, diversity is wonderful. You have a lot of people there of different ethnicities, different races, different backgrounds, people who bring their experiences to bear and can have conversations that broaden and deepen their commitment to this common purpose. And it's not just churches. He used the example of the Army. If you've ever, I'm sure most people in this room know folks who have served in the military. You talk to folks who serve in the military, it's a pretty diverse group of folks who serve in the military, and they all see each other as brothers and sisters. They all see each other as comrades because they have the same common purpose. You have to have a communal moral purpose because we exist not only as individuals, we exist as members of communities, and we want to be members of communities. Finally, we need communal capacity. So we have to feel like we have a system that allows us to act out in the world as individuals, as free, reasoning people, and also that can activate when necessary to get the big things done, to defend ourselves against foreign threat, to ensure that people who can't take care of themselves don't fall through the cracks. Right? These are the four things you need: individual moral purpose, individual capacity, communal moral purpose, and communal capacity. The civilization that has been best at filling these four silos has been the Judeo-Christian civilization of the West. Western civilization has been the best at doing this. This is why we have prosperity. It's why we have free markets. It's why we have democracy. For people who don't appreciate the civilization in which they live, they need to understand that Western civilization is the cause of all the good things they have in their life. There's Now, there's a basic disconnect right now in Western civilization about the nature of Western civilization. On one side, it's a little too broad to term it the right, but we will for purposes of this conversation. For one side, Western civilization is the font head. It's the place where we got all these great, eternal, wonderful values, and then we spread those values gradually to bigger and bigger groups of people. We haven't always lived up to the promise of those values, but that's what Western civilization is. Western civilization is a climb up a mountain, but the mountain itself is the principle. And so you look at the history of the United States and you see the great principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. You say these are good, and they weren't extended properly to black folks. They weren't extended properly to women. They weren't extended properly to Jews. They weren't extended properly to a wide variety of groups. And the story of America is how we took these amazing principles, this is the big bang of ideas, and we spread those out to encompass more and more people. So the story of Western civilization is a story of good, and a story of good that is constantly moving over obstacles. It's a story that spans from the Revolution to hundreds of thousands of Americans dying in a civil war to free black slaves, to civil rights marchers marching in the streets of Selma to ensure that black people have full rights. That's the story of Western civilization. Then there's the other side. The other side says Western civilization is bad. Western civilization has a lot of problems. Western civilization has been responsible for genocide. It's been responsible for slavery. It's been responsible for racism and xenophobia. It's been responsible for all these things. And all of these highfalutin principles you guys talk about, that's a bunch of nonsense because you didn't apply them to everybody, so they really didn't exist. They were just an excuse for you to feel good about yourself while you were engaging in a power hierarchy dominance. Because you were successful, and so you're basically stepping on other people and using free markets or free speech to do so. These principles didn't exist. It was just a mask for your power. That's not true, and the easy way to tell that that's not true is that all of the great evils that have existed in Western civilization have existed in virtually every other culture. All of the great goods of Western civilization have existed here and only here. All of the things that we enjoy, the prosperity, the technology, the democracy, all of that stuff happens in the West, and it happens for a reason. So now is the part where I explain what that reason is. So Jerusalem and Athens, we get some fundamental principles from Judeo-Christian values, and this is just historically accurate. Judeo-Christian values lie at the root of Western civilization. There's no other way to put it. Everybody who created Western civilization was a Christian. Everybody who created Western civilization was a Jew. Everybody who created Western civilization was a secular person who grew up in a Jewish or Christian society, a Judeo-Christian society. I had this conversation with Sam Harris, a militant atheist, and Sam and I were talking about why we shared the same values. And Sam said, well, you know, my values come from my wide reading in philosophy and my study of neurobiology and all of this. I said, right, but I didn't do any of that stuff, and I have the same values as you, so explain why our values match. And he said, okay, so what's your theory? I said, my theory is that we grew up 10 miles from each other in Los Angeles after 3,000 years of common Judeo-Christian heritage. That's my theory. So what exactly does Judeo-Christian heritage teach? Well, it teaches a couple things that you would have to assume that cannot actually be reasoned to. You can't logic your way to these fundamental principles. They have to be revealed to you. One, God is unified and a master plan stands behind everything. So we take that for granted, that the universe is an understandable place, and that the actions we take in the universe can make an impact in our lives, because the universe is not just a random bag of chaos. It's in that your life is not just a matter of you wake up in the morning and a bunch of gods are fighting over you, and then some like you and some don't, and they decide that they're going to tie your shoelaces together today. That's not what the universe is. The universe is instead a set of generally orderly rules. We can't always understand God's logic, but our minds reflect God's to the extent that we can at least suss out the basic notion that there is a logic to the universe, and we can see the hand of God in the events that happen in the universe. Paganism is largely about chaos and fate, and the idea of a unified God with a master plan standing behind everything, that is something that springs from a monotheistic God, a mind that stands behind the universe. The second fundamental principle of Judeo-Christian morality is that human beings are held to morality not out of any subjective love for morality, but because there is such a thing as objective morality. There is a right and there is a wrong, and it is not subject to how you feel today. If you look at the value of sacrifices in the pagan world, to take an example, sacrifices in the pagan world were always about appeasing God. The God was ticked at you, and so you sacrificed a chicken, and then God was going to be happy with you, and now everything was going to be hunky-dory. Sacrifices in the Bible are meant to be a different thing, and people who don't actually study the Bible and don't spend a lot of time with the Old or the New Testaments don't understand that what the sacrifices were originally meant to be was not a way of bribing God. They were meant to be a moral reminder that all of your property is actually yours because God gave it to you, and thus you are recognizing the sovereignty of God through your sacrifices. That is not the same thing as God's ticked at me, so he's probably going to like this chicken. The third fundamental principle of Judeo-Christian values is that history progresses, that there's a progress to history. So many pagan religions believe that history is circular, it's cyclical, that it goes up and it goes down, it goes up and it goes down, or that it's eternal and just kind of washes in and out. The Judeo-Christian heritage is a heritage that says slavery moves toward freedom, and human rights violations move toward human rights non-violation, and that paganism moves toward monotheism, and that you're instrumental in moving history forward, which means you have an obligation to help God out by doing what he wants you to do. And finally, Judeo-Christianity assumes that we have free choice. It assumes that we are responsible for the decisions that we make, and we have a duty to make correct decisions. As God says in Deuteronomy, I set before you today life and prosperity and death and destruction. Choose life so you and your children may live. If you don't believe in these fundamental principles, it's very difficult to build a civilization. Because if you don't believe that there is an orderly plan to the universe, it's hard to operate in that universe. If you don't believe that there's an objective morality, then why shouldn't I victimize somebody else who lives in the society with me? If I don't believe that history progresses, then what difference does it make what I do today? And if I don't believe that we have free choice, then I'm not even responsible for my own decisions. Okay, so that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is reason. Because if we just had the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's very easy to end up at theocracy, at forcing your religiously revealed views down on everybody else. You don't end up with religious diversity. You don't end up with the Judeo-Christian value system. You just end up with whatever is the specific doctrinal system that is being imposed from above. And that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing because you do need a variety of viewpoints within a common tradition in order to make that tradition better. As I said early on, diversity of viewpoints is good so long as you have the same common goal. So you need reason on the other side. So Judeo-Christianity without reason ends up at theocracy. Reason, as we'll see, without Judeo-Christianity ends up in gulags and gas chambers. So the other side of the coin, though, is the use of reason. And this is where Greece comes in, the idea of Greek purpose and teleology. The idea that there is a purpose in nature. The idea of the natural law comes from the Greeks. That you can look at anything in the world and determine that it has a use because there is a mind behind it. And this is why Aquinas is able to merge Aristotle with the Bible fairly easily, because he looks at the idea of the unmoved mover and he says, oh, well, obviously that's God, which is true. Aristotle felt the same way. There was an unmoved mover, and that unmoved mover had created purposes in nature, and we could discover the purposes in nature by looking at nature. So look at the evidence on the ground, and then you see that there is a purpose to this thing. And there is a purpose to a human being, and this is what gives you your purpose. What makes a human being different, what makes a human being good, is you fulfilling your fundamental purpose. The idea of the Aristotelian good is very different from how we think of good. We think of good as good and bad morally, making a moral decision. Aristotle thought of good somewhat like this. A good hammer is a hammer that is effective at hitting nails. A good spoon is a spoon that is effective at picking up soup. And a good person is a person who's effective at using that which distinguishes human beings from everything else, the ability to use reason. This is where reason becomes paramount in Western thought. And because of that, we have to study the universe around us, and that becomes the basis of science. We can actually look at the world around us, and we can make hypotheses about that world, and then we can look at the evidence and see if that matches up with the hypothesis to know the mind of the unmoved mover and to understand our own purpose better in the universe. We end up at a democracy because the state must be limited in order to forward the natural law. Anytime the state violates the natural law, then the state becomes no longer justified. This is the root of American revolutionary thinking. Right? It's easy to see the idea of a dominant state, an all-powerful dominant state that is the source of your rights. In fact, this is what much of the modern left thinks. You don't have rights that pre-exist government. Your rights come from government. That's not what the Greeks thought. At least that's not what Aristotle thought. He thought that you had natural rights that sprang from natural law. You look at the universe, and the universe says you have the capacity to reason. If a government violates your capacity to reason, it violates its own reason for being. A government that violates natural law has lost its reason for existence. Cicero and the Stoics bring this to fruition when they start talking about republicanism and the idea of a mixed system. You have a mixed system of aristocracy and democracy. Well, this tension is what built the United States, and you can see all of these strains come together in the American founding. The notion of all men having equal freedom and independence, that springs originally from the biblical notion of man being made in God's image, the single most important verse in the history of humanity. Human beings are made with actual, individual value, and you don't have to reason your way to it, because for most of human history we didn't. That is just a truth. It's a fundamental truth we all have to assume so we can get it from God. We are all important because we're made in the image of God. That is in the Declaration of Independence. The idea that liberty to exercise our will is necessary in government, that comes from a merger between Greek tradition and Judeo-Christian tradition. And freedom can only exist if we have a strong social fabric to back it up, if we have a strong moral and religious people. This was this was a universal view of the founders with the possible exception of Thomas Paine. Virtually every founder believed that you needed a moral and religious people if you were going to have freedom. The freedoms that we enjoy rest on the idea that we care for one another in our daily lives and that we are good to one another. Because if we do not act well to one another, then our freedom quickly deteriorates into libertinism and us victimizing one another. We need a moral and religious people, as John Adams said, or as Washington said, the foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality. There exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. We focus a lot in the United States right now on rights, but the founders focused a lot in the early going on duties as well as rights. Every right came along with duties. Your right to free speech came along with a duty to use that free speech well, to study and speak well and converse with others. Your right to bear arms came along with a duty to use those arms to protect yourself, your family, and your country. Right? Rights were duties, and duties were rights. They were all the same side, two sides of the same coin. That's the merger. As I said before, if you get rid of either Jerusalem or Athens, all this falls apart. You get rid of Judeo-Christian morality, you end up with hedonism. You end up with people trying to reason their way to moral purpose. And that goes some really dark places. Because you can reason your way to a world where the individual no longer matters. After all, if you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, you just go ahead and do so. This is how you end up at gulags. If you can build a better utopia by harming a few people, but it's better for most people, we'll go ahead and do it. There's no natural rights that necessarily spring from reason. The same thing is true when it comes to things like free speech. Why have free speech if you know you're right? Right? If reason dictates a particular outcome, then why should we have to have a conversation about it? You see shades of this when it comes to a lot of calls for censorship today on a wide variety of topics online. We have to censor people. It's not because they're dangerous, but because they're wrong. That's dangerous stuff. Reason can lead you to a path where these rights no longer exist. And as I say, if you're just looking at biblical living, there's nothing in there that prevents theocracy. You need these two things to be in tension. You need that balance. You need to apply reason to biblical revelation, but you need the basis of biblical revelation to provide the framework for reason itself. All of this is important to re-educate ourselves in. This is all basic to a lot of religious people, people who study philosophy. The fact is that if we don't re-educate ourselves, we lose all of it. Because we are an ungrateful people. We are ungrateful people. It's hard not to be. You grow up in a country, particularly people my age and younger, I can still call myself young for the moment. We grow up in a society that is rich beyond all imagination, no existential foe to threaten us. We don't even remember the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall fell when I was 7 years old. And for many people in this room, the Berlin Wall fell before they were born. You don't remember the existential threat. You don't remember what it's like to look at other countries and think, we couldn't be living like that. You think that the natural state of being is to live in prosperity, to live in freedom, to not be bothered by the government. You think that all this is natural. It is absolutely the opposite of natural. It is the opposite of natural. What is natural to human beings is tribalism, us getting together in our own little racial groups and clubbing at each other. And you see a reversion to this in the intersectional theory of the left and in the white supremacy that you're seeing on the alt-right, both of which are absolutely morally reprehensible and disgusting, and a violation of fundamental principles of Western civilization. What's natural with human beings is self-interest, and us going out and doing what we want at the expense of other people. That's not something that altruism is only natural for the in-group. It's not natural to everyone. It's natural for you and your family. It's not natural to the guy who lives 10 miles away, necessarily. The fact is that you have to cultivate virtue. You have to cultivate an appreciation for your civilization. So here's what we need to understand. We need to understand that everything from the iPhone in our pocket to the planes we fly on, to the freedoms that we experience, are built on a 3,000-year history that took a long time to develop. And we are living at the leading tip of that spear. We are living at the top of this iceberg. And we can either carve away at the bottom of the iceberg and then hope this thing floats, or we can recognize that that iceberg needs to be constantly shored up. The foundations of the building need to be constantly shored up. We need to remind ourselves why the foundations are important. If we do that, then we can build minarets and towers. They'll be greater than any that have yet to be built. Thanks so much. Happy to take questions.
If you have a question for Mr. Shapiro, please form a line towards the back of the venue behind my colleague. If you come up to the front, you will be directed to the rear of the venue. Additionally, please limit to just one question. I will hold the microphone for you during your question, and please ensure that your question is a question. Furthermore, there will be no follow-up responses after you ask the question. Thank you.
Oh yeah, as always, I do have my one rule, which is that if you disagree on anything, it's not on the speech, just generally, you disagree with me on any topic, you go to the front of the line, and we like disagreements and discussions.
Do you believe that today's liberal views on finance promoted by millennials and members of Generation Z are similar to those of the hippie movements in the 1960s and 70s?
On finance? Yeah, I mean, they're effectively similar. Yeah, I mean, I think that Bernie Sanders in 1970 looks like Bernie Sanders in 2019. He just has less hair.
Why do you think it is that I love you, Ben. Why do you think it is that so many colleges in this day is moving so far left when, like you were saying, the ideas that we have from Judeo-Christian values, they still stand true today. So why do you think it is that so many of these colleges and so many of students of our age are moving so far that way when we haven't even lived under a lot of the things they're trying to implement?
I think that there's something comfortable about believing. Here's the nice thing about being woke. Being woke means that people are going to basically leave you alone. There's a group of what I've termed woke souls who make life miserable for everybody who dares to disagree with them. The easiest thing is just to say, fine, I have white privilege, and then move on with their life. And the squeakiest wheel gets the grease in this sense. The truth is that colleges have been very much to the left since the 1970s. They started moving really far to the left in the 1960s, when the hippies took over the universities. And they've remained so ever since. There is also a self-enforcing echo chamber that exists at these universities, both procedurally and then socially. So procedurally, if you are applying for a dissertation with a leftist professor, the chances that you can write a right-wing dissertation, a conservative dissertation, are very low. And that's a problem, because professors effectively create the next generation of professors, so it's hard to get past that. Beyond that, there's also an echo chamber that exists on campus where professors, like many in the media, seem to fall into this trap of thinking that because everybody immediately around them agrees with them, that means what they're saying is fact as opposed to opinion. And that's really incredibly dangerous. That echo chamber is extraordinarily powerful. And it does have an impact on how professors think and how they treat people who are outside that bubble. So it's a comfort level thing for a lot of students. A lot of students want to feel like, one, they're rebelling against their parents, or two, they want to be term tolerant. They're afraid of being called intolerant. They're afraid of being called bigots, because that's the worst thing you can call somebody in America today. And so they tend to cave to social pressure. That's on the student side. On the administrative side, there's that self-reinforcing echo chamber that's incredibly dangerous.
All right, everybody. My name is Pilar Arias. There's still about 198 of you with us. I would like to thank you very, very much for joining us, for watching Fox News Now, which is a part of Fox10Phoenix.com. Wrapping up the night live in Manhattan, New York City, Radio City Music Hall right there, pretty close to the Fox News headquarters. Matter of fact, I believe the camera is coming off the Fox News Channel headquarters right there in New York. Again, my name is Pilar Arias. Normally we do this from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. Arizona time every single day, Monday through Friday. My name, again, Pilar Arias. Mike Page, another News Now host, and we've got you covered with any news across the country, whether it's live, it's breaking, it's an event that you want to know about or you want to be at. We've got you covered because of our partnerships of all the Fox stations across the country and other stations as well. When any news breaks, you know you can trust us right here, and you never know when we might end up in your community. I know we have some not everyday viewers currently watching because we had Ben Shapiro right here in Phoenix, so feel free to let us know where you are watching from. And before you depart for the evening, please like, share, subscribe, let your friends, your family, your coworkers, your neighbors, everybody you know about us. That way it can be kind of a water cooler situation. You all can show up at work tomorrow and have something to talk about. Be like, hey, did you watch News Now? Did you see that Ben Shapiro was at Grand Canyon University? And did you see that News Now had it live? Isn't that remarkable? We cover a lot of politics here as well, everybody. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Please join us again tomorrow. The reason I'm going to be cutting right now is because I would like to leave the Ben Shapiro event as what we call a standalone event on YouTube. I'm trying to not get any other news of the day in here, but if any news breaks that you need to know about within the next 15 minutes, I will hop back on and make sure that you know about it. Everybody have a great evening. We'll see you again tomorrow for the Thursday edition of News Now. Take care.